Andor's story takes place 5 years before Rogue One, a Star Wars story, so the show has the chance to find out what the Empire's threat to the galaxy means, and Andor is doing a good job of that. That's why we are going to discuss what makes the Empire so scary, and answer why there hasn't been a stormtrooper in Andor yet. So sit back and relax. First off, what makes the Empire so scary? Other Star Wars media has tried to tell the story of how the Rebel Alliance started, but now Andor is set to be the definitive Rebel story, mainly because it's more realistic and has a more serious tone. Cassian Andor is the main character, and his journey from Kenari to Scarif is what the show is about.
But Andor is telling a bigger story about many different people, from the Empire to the Rebel Alliance, which doesn't exist yet. And so far, Andor has done more to set up questions than to answer them in its first 4 episodes. And as Andor's take on the Star Wars universe is more realistic than the rest of the show has been able to go to places in the saga that were not expected by the fans. Andor can also dive into the ideas that were only touched on in the background of the Star Wars movies. Many recent Star Wars stories haven't shown what makes the Empire scary, especially when compared to how George Lucas imagined the Empire and how Palpatine's reign of terror came to be. During episode 5 of Andor, Karis and Cassian talk about what they are fighting for and what they have lost in their fight against the Empire, and freedom is a theme that comes up throughout the episode.
This loss of freedom, which Andor talks about, makes the Empire so scary, followed by George Lucas's Star Wars always focused on the loss of freedom. Well, die-hard fans may be able to recall that from the first Star Wars movie to the prequel trilogy, George Lucas's Star Wars movies have always been about things that happen in the real world. That's probably because George Lucas studied social science and anthropology before choosing film as his major, and this background would later show up in his Star Wars movies. Even though the original trilogy put viewers right in the middle of the war between the powerful Empire and the underdog rebellion, the prequels could go back in time and show how the Republic turned into an oppressive Sith Empire led by Palpatine. According to Mr. Lucas, he didn't want to tell a story about how democracy was taken away from the galaxy. Instead, he wanted to tell a story about how do you give away a democracy. People didn't like the extensive, boring political meeting scenes in Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, and the rest of the prequel trilogy. But those scenes were important to the story George Lucas wanted to tell. And that's the thing. The original trilogy was about how unlikely heroes fought for the galaxy's lost freedom. The prequels, on the other hand, were about how that freedom was lost in the first place. Next up, recent Star Wars had made the Empire's threat too superficial. Star Wars will always have content for people of all ages, but recent movies and TV shows have made the Empire's threat too shallow. This means that the Empire has become nothing more than an obstacle in the main characters' stories. And with so many stories set during the Galactic Civil War and sequels taking a lot from the Age of the Empire, the idea of stormtroopers and TIE fighters have lost much of its original impact. Instead of being a sign of how bad the galaxy had gotten, the Empire started to be shown as a more cartoonish group of supervillains that the Jedi and other Star Wars characters had to fight. The Empire is losing its street cred. If we talk about Rogue One, it was billed as a more serious and visceral take on the Rebels versus Empire story, but it turned out to be more of an action movie, with the Empire just getting in the way of the heroes. The same thing happens in Solo, a Star Wars story, where the Empire is talked about but not felt as a threat. Also, Obi-Wan Kenobi is another story that takes place at the height of the Rebels versus Empire war, but it focuses more on the fantasy parts, like Darth Vader and the Inquisitors. Not to mention, Episode 5 honors Revenge of the Sith's best line. We can all agree that Padme's line, "So this is how liberty dies," with thunderous applause, is by far the best line in Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, and perfectly sums up the story George Lucas was trying to tell from Episode 1 to Episode 3. Not a stretch. Palpatine using the Clone Wars to get more power and break up the galaxy would be a recurring theme in the Clone Wars. If we look at what happened between The Phantom Menace and Revenge of the Sith from a certain distance, it should have been clear to everyone what the Sith Lord's ultimate plan was, and the same theme kept going in Episode 5 of Andor. Karis talked about how people slowly forgot what the Empire was doing to the the galaxy when he talked about how dangerous the Empire was and why he was fighting.
He also told Cassian that freedom was being taken away from the galaxy, starting with the smallest things. This is an interesting twist on the thunderous applause from the Revenge of the Sith. Now, let's look at how Episode 5 summarizes what truly makes the Empire scary.
More than stormtroopers, TIE fighters, and Imperial cruisers are what makes the Empire a threat. That's how it took away all hope and optimism from the galaxy for almost 2 decades. Aside from small groups like the Ghost Crew from Star Wars Rebels and Operation Luthen set up in Andor, there weren't many people fighting against the Empire. And the New Hope didn't come into being until Luke Skywalker answered the hero's call. This means that any story between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope were about the despair and losses the galaxy was facing. This brings us to our point. Most Star Wars movies and TV shows set in that period didn't do that, but Andor as a show remembers it and has the full essence of the loss of freedom. Coming up next, new villains introduced in Andor. So far in the show, the Empire has been shown from a different point of view than it usually is in Star Wars. The focus has been on the people in charge behind the scenes of the Empire's forces. This includes Cyril Karn, a deputy inspector of Pre-Mor Authority, a company that works for the Empire and is in charge of a certain trade sector. As for Pre-Mor, they were the main bad guys in most of episodes 1 through 3 of Andor, with Cyril Karn often being the face of this against Cassian. But episodes 4 and 5 have started to go deeper into Imperial politics. For example, the Imperial Security Bureau were introduced in the show. This brought in new villains like Dedra Meero and Major Partagaz, who will probably continue to be problems for Andor, Mon Mothma, and Luthen. Moving on to, so why aren't there any stormtroopers in Andor? Despite all these bad guys, stormtroopers have been missing from the list of Star Wars bad guys for a long time. Surprisingly, we haven't seen a single stormtrooper in the first 5 episodes of Andor. The reason for this may seem strange, since Star Wars fans have made many jokes about how bad stormtroopers are at their jobs over the years. Even so, stormtroopers are seen as the best soldiers the Empire has, and they are only used when they are most needed. This also fits with their previous appearances, since they've only shown up in important situations like big battles or with Sith or Jedi. And since Andor has had a more realistic tone and hasn't shown anything that would make a stormtrooper pay attention, it makes sense that they haven't shown up. Instead, the focus has been on things like Pre-Mor security or the ISB. Last but not least, will stormtroopers appear in Andor? Well, this doesn't mean that stormtroopers will never be in Andor. Since the show is supposed to lead right into Rogue One, a Star Wars story, it's very likely that stormtroopers will show up at some point. After all, the show's official trailer shows many stormtroopers and elite death troopers from Star Wars, and as Season 1 of Andor picks up speed and the characters continue to catch the Empire's attention, stormtroopers will likely be sent to these parts of the galaxy to keep them safe for the Empire. Also, the show is about how the Rebel Alliance got started, so it makes sense to make the stormtroopers a more serious threat that the Empire only uses to deal with bigger problems. That's all for this video. What are your thoughts on the direction Andor is taking? And do you want to see stormtroopers in the show? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more exciting content in the future. Thanks for watching. See you next time.